The Interfaith Institute is a fantastic place. It's done many wonderful things. Dick and Sylvia, we all, everyone, not just in the US, but in the world, everyone who believes in the interaction of faiths owes you a debt. Doug, it's been great. We've been talking mathematics, we've been talking all kinds of things. It's been wonderful spending this time here. I'm very glad that the pandemic allowed us, the spring allowed us all to come together. Thank you for being here and dedicating your heartbeats to this conversation. I think it's always a bad sign when a speaker has to, first can't see his sermon, and second has to explain his title, but especially the explaining the title. But I'm going to do what Doug did, and I'm going to, but it's a fact that each of the two main words in my title, religion and race, are enough to provoke an argument. Even if we think we each know what we mean when we use the words, they're highly disputed. Scholars of religion debate whether you can even use the word religion anymore. This may surprise you. Take the word race, for example. Some of my colleagues feel strongly that race and racism were born in the plantation slavery of North America and the Caribbean. They're tied to skin color, and you can't talk about them in any other context. Other scholars I know would include in the cluster of ideas we call racism, the Nazi anti-Semitic ideologies that motivated or legitimated the extermination of Jews in World War II. Still others might include white Christian attitudes towards Muslim immigrants in Europe or America. And many, even those willing to accept the last two phenomena as examples of race and racism, might still claim that religion is not an important factor in the formation of any of these ideas. And they'd say, well, what really matters is other factors. I don't know, biological determinism, economic interests, political utility, but not religion. Now, I'm not here to tell you that our faith traditions are primary sources of racism. Quite the contrary. All of our faiths have produced many visions of humanity, including powerfully universal ideals. I think that we are all created in God's image is one of the most frequently cited universal, from the Hebrew Bible, one of the most frequently cited examples of such universalism. But I think it's important to realize that that our religions are also capable of producing ideas that we would call racial and of producing what we would call racism. And I think it's important to understand that, because only if we understand the role that our religions play in producing some of these ideas, can we understand why those ideas are so persistent, so resistant to our best efforts to overcome them. So I want to offer a kind of explanation of why this is so, why so many of our religions have proven capable of producing racism as well as of contesting racism, so that we can become more aware of the potential prejudices in our own ideals. So let me start with an example of what I consider to be a contemporary religious racism, so that we can get a common sense of why the phenomenon is relevant today. The Christian identity movement is a general term for an array of groups that play a fairly prominent role in white supremacist politics in the United States today. CI, I'm going to call it CI because it's shorter than Christian identity, belongs to a family of ideas called Anglo-Israelitism. And some of this stuff is pretty exotic. But Anglo-Israelitism we find already in 18th century England. It's the idea that the Anglo-Saxons, the etymology Isaac's sons, Saxon comes from Isaac's son, that the Anglo-Saxons are the true descendants of Israel rather than the Jews. And for this reason, according to some variants of the Anglo-Israelitism, the Jews seek to destroy the Anglo-Saxons. That idea has taken many forms in the English-speaking world. I'll return to it at the end of this lecture to give you some examples of major religions that have borrowed from that idea. And it's inspired many movements. One of those movements is the Christian identity movement. Here's an introduction to one of the theological arguments of the Christian identity movement from the writings of Pastor Dan Gayman, who was the son of dissident Mormons, who in 1972 founded the Church of Israel in Shell, Missouri. And I'm going to leave you to, can you all see the slide? So I'll leave you to read it because I know that you all read better or as well as I do. So, yeah, all done. Let me remind you of Genesis 3:15. It's the passage in which God put enmity between the seed of the serpent and the seed of Eve. Gaiman is putting that passage to the work of justifying what is sometimes called the Christian identity movement's two-seed theory. Two seeds, not one seed, two seeds. As its name implies, this is a polygenetic argument of human origins, in which whites are the descendants of Adam and Eve's most favored seed. Blacks and other races descend from mixtures with Adam and Eve's less favored seeds. And the Jews are not descended from Adam at all, but rather are the serpent's seed, children of Satan. The position is often buttressed by reference to New Testament verses, such as this one from the Gospel of John. So the two-seed theory has two broad ratio-religious goals. On the one hand, it's meant to cast the Jews in biological terms as eternal enemies of Christianity. So you'll notice that I won't read Pastor Gaiman's words because I find them kind of objectionable in my own mouth, but I will leave you to read them. And I know that the type here is a little small, but by their very nature, etc. On the other hand, it's meant to present the white race as the Christian force in a cosmological race war, with the Jews cast as masterminds of the anti-white and anti-Christian forces, eternal enemies of the white race. In this sense, the two-seed line theology is a Christian version of the Great Replacement. That's the last technical term I'll use, the Great Replacement theory, one of the most important ideologies of white ethno-nationalist movements in Europe and North America today, not just American, Hungarian, French, everywhere. Replacement theorists understand the increasing diversity of Western Europe and North America as a result of a concerted effort to destroy white Christian cultures. In many versions, such as this one, that effort is led by Jewish advocates of non-white and non-Christian, so read Muslim, immigration, civil rights for non-whites, non-Christians, and non-heterosexuals. Whoever advocates for those things is the enemy. Brenton Tarrant, who murdered 51 people during an attack on two mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand in 2019, Patrick Crusius, who murdered 21 people at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas the same year, and Robert Bowers, who murdered 11 at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh in 2018, all subscribed to the replacement theory. I offer here Robert Bowers' last social media post, lest you think I've strayed too far from my topic of race and religion. And just as dangerously, many politicians have flirted with or embraced this idea, both in Europe and the United States, and even in countries that have virtually no Jews, few Muslims, and few non-whites. And I offer you here the example of Hungary with an anti-Soros. So in Hungary, Soros plays the role of the Jewish manipulator of the Great Replacement, who's seeking to replace Christian white Hungarians with Muslim immigrants. So what do you think? Is this an example of the intersection of race and religion? I mean, I offered it as an opening to make plausible that it is. And my use of the word intersection here is provocative because the term intersectionality, coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, occupies an important place in race theory today. As, and I'm going to quote from the Wikipedia definition, my go-to source for everything, quote, an analytical framework for understanding how aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to create different modes of discrimination and privilege. So what I'm suggesting is that in replacement theory, a seed theory about Judaism, articulated in biblical terms, does intersectional work to legitimate discrimination against non-whites, non-Christians, and non-heterosexuals, intersectionality. The fact that all of these identities are linked together, or that it is Jews who are the masterminds rather than Blacks or Asians or any other group, does not make replacement theories less racist or less dangerous, which is why I listed the death toll from these theories already. So how seriously should we take the role of the scriptural language of seed and lineage in the creation and justification of ideologies like this one? And that's really the key, the kernel, it's a pun, the kernel of my talk. Is it just a convention, a convenient borrowing, an effort to buttress a modern idea with ancient scriptural authority? Or is it a potential always present in Christianity, Islam, Judaism, or other religious traditions, a potential we need to be aware of so that we can be prepared to recognize and combat it when it emerges? Well, you probably won't be surprised that that second position is going to be the one I'm going to try to justify. And to justify it, I'm going to offer you a short history of this idea. The idea that cultural differences and similarities between humans are reproduced and transmitted as the organism reproduces itself through sexual reproduction, which is my shorthand definition of that family of ideas we call race. That history is very long indeed. Long before writing, long before cities and kingdoms, many people in many different places noticed that the reproduction of plants and animals generates both similarity and difference. Offspring are in some ways like the parent and in some ways not. Surely you have noticed this too. Choose the offspring with the traits you favor and repeat the reproduction, and sameness and difference again manifest themselves, sometimes trending towards the traits you're looking for. And I bet you didn't do that with your children, but you do it with animals and plants all the time. Biologists call this activity artificial selection, in contrast with natural selection. And archaeologists call its agricultural consequences the Neolithic Revolution, which produced founder crops across much of the world by 9,500 BCE. Wheat, rye, barley in the Middle East, rice in South Asia and across the Indo-Pacific, in the Andes, potatoes, maize and squash in Mesoamerica. Humans were breeding and selecting seed for all of these by 10,000 BC. Animals too were bred, pigs and poultry, sheep, llamas, cows, horses, camels, even elephants. Humans noticed the power of seed selection for many different needs in different places. We can even find evidence now with DNA archaeology of selective breeding for sled dogs taking place in the Siberian Arctic at the same time that domesticated grains were emerging in the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East. The knowledge behind these Neolithic reproductive practices was often wrong, and I'm sure the same will be said of our practices 12,000 years from now. But it was astoundingly successful. It domesticated many species of plant and animal, and its success provided what we might call the cognitive foundations of natural history. Those foundations enabled the densities of population, the stratification and specialization of labor, and the scale of resource extraction necessary for the emergence of big cities, big polities, big gods. Agriculture, that is the exploitation of the reproductive potential of plants and animal seed, transformed the possibilities of culture. And among the many products of those transformations is what I'm calling the intersection of race and religion. And that is this idea, the idea that privilege and stigma are apportioned and reproduced among gods and humans through the selection of seed. You see, I'm taking you back to really, really early seed theories in religion, long before Pastor Gaiman. That idea is already found stamped in the clay of humanity's earliest written records. Good seed, king chosen by Enlil, begins one Sumerian poem to the fertility god Ninurta, circa 2,500 BC. In English, we use different words to distinguish between botanical and animal, male and female gametes, but the Sumerian word numun in the poem means seed of a plant, or of an animal, or of a human, seed of a male and seed of a female. They didn't have different words for these. This is the case in many ancient languages, including Hebrew, Greek, and Arabic, where we encounter words like progeny, lineage, offspring, children, descendants. In English translations of the scriptures of these, of many ancient texts, including the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and the Quran, the word in the original is often simply seed. So Enlil, I'm not sure why I'm giving you this slide here, but there it is. I'll probably come by. It probably belongs somewhere. Enlil is the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon, and Ninurta is his good seed, by which the poet means that Ninurta, the god king of fertility, is Enlil's chosen offspring. This god is that god's chosen offspring. We can find similar agricultural, reproductive, and biocosmological explanations for the transmission of divine privilege and stigma, not only throughout the ancient Near East, but also in much of the rest of the world, from Hawaii and the Inca Empire to the Shang emperors of China in its earliest historical dynasty. So an ancient Greek once quipped that if horses had gods, those gods would look like horses. The Sumerians thought of their gods as selectors of seed because that's what they were. They cultivated their own seed as well as the seed of the field, their own reproductive lineages, and they imagined that their gods did the same. Sumerians imagined that structuring the world through the curation of reproduction was the common concern of both gods and humans. They could even conceive of humanity itself as the product of divine agriculture, as here in the Song of the Hoe, Enlil, who will make the human seed of the land come forth from the earth. And in the song, he used his hoe in order to separate heaven from earth, to separate earth from heaven and make it possible for humans to grow. That's a quote. So later peoples of the ancient Near East will share these concerns, and so will their gods. You are divine beings. You are all sons of Elyon, the Israelite high God says to all of the divine offspring in verse 6 of Psalm 82. But now you shall die like human, and like any of the rulers shall you fall. Arise, O Elohim, judge the earth, for you shall make your estate among the nations. So like Enlil and like the ancient breeders, Elyon is here selecting one offspring and culling all the others. If this reading of the psalm feels shocking, it's because we tend not to notice the importance of seed selection across a long history of relations between humans and gods. This is the book of the generation of Jesus, begins the Gospel of Matthew before launching into a long list of begats. Or as the Quran puts it, truly God chose Adam, Noah, the house of Abraham, and the house of Imran above the worlds as seed, one from the other. Is it too obvious to point out that the mastery over seed ranks high amongst the powers granted to Adam? Genesis 1:29, I've given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of the earth. Now, clearly those seeds struck later Greek and Latin translators as important, judging by the poetic alliteration they devoted to it. Here it is in the Greek Septuagint, sporimon, spadon, sperma. St. Augustine turns it into equally sibilant Latin, seminale, seminans, semen. In Genesis, the seeds of plants, animals, and humans, as well as gods, reproduce and even mix. Reproduction and mixing that is used to explain the vast and contending diversity of the cosmos, even across species boundaries. And here we have our favorite quote. Even the serpent, but I put the others there too for you. I mean, even the serpent is my favorite. You can have your own favorites. It's differences in seed also explain and transmit differences between humans, beginning with the aftermath of Cain's murder of Abel. For God, here you have Eve saying, has appointed for me a new seed. There's also the mixture between the daughters of men and the sons of God, so between divine and human beings. And of course, it was to keep seed alive upon the face of the earth that God instructed Noah to build the ark. And it's in terms of seed that he explained his pact with creation after the flood. And it's in terms of Noah's seed in the person of his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, that the world's repopulation is described in Genesis 10, the so-called Table of Nations. Every one of these passages has a long past and a long future. For example, the question of what happens when human and supernatural seeds mix may not occupy too much of your attention, but it animated many debates and inspired a number of influential texts. I think of, for example, the Book of Enoch, which is not a book in our canonical Bible, but it is canonical for the Ethiopic church. These questions remain alive today. Genesis 6, for example, the daughters and sons, has been invoked by some members of the Nation of Islam in the United States to explain the origins of white devils. And plenty of popular culture, from Buffy the Vampire Slayer to Lucifer, is animated by imagining erotic relations between divine and human. This is the cleanest slide I could find from Lucifer to offer you. Given the importance of Genesis to the Christian and Muslim future, it's important to stress that the organization of these traditions about seed into a geography of the world did not originate in some essential Israelite impulse, but took place under the influence of other cultures doing similar work. We've already seen that all of these previous cultures were doing similar things. Now, at the same time as the Israelites are really editing Genesis into the form in which we receive it, the Greeks are turning to the flood hero Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha to repopulate their world. The two mappings of peoples were even interconnected. The Greek Eon, for example, appears in Genesis' table of nations as Yavan, son of Japheth and father of Elisha and Tarshish. Given that the Persian Empire ruled much of the world occupied by the Greeks and Hebrews at that time, and if we were given to studies in comparative religion, we might say that both accounts, the Greek and the Hebrew, came together under the influence of the Persian founding hero Phredon, who also had 3 sons who divided up the world between them. Israelite ethnogeographies did later become useful for much of the rest of the world, but this was not because of any action or originality of the Israelites. It's because first Christianity and then Islam became world religions, defeating, among others, the Persians, and put these foundation stories to work in new worlds. So one objection I can imagine to this argument I've been giving you runs along these lines. Okay, I can accept that the ancient Sumerians, Egyptians, Israelites, Greeks, or Persians were racist and put emphasis on seed and lineage, but surely Christianity and Islam as universal religions did not. So I need to convince you that those traditions too turned constantly to the vocabulary of reproduction and inheritance, seed and semen, paternity and maternity, genealogy and embryology, grafting and adoption in order to imagine the reproduction of relationships between humanity and divinity. Because remember, race and religion, I defined its intersection as the idea that privilege and stigma in relation to the gods are transmitted reproductively. They too proved capable of justifying a range of positions, ideals, and ideas ranging from extreme biological determinism to radical spiritual universalism. And their ideas shaped many future racial imaginations, including, I insist, our own. It would take many books to make that point convincing and many more hours than you're willing to give me, I'm sure. So let me just suggest that one way to do that, one way to write those books would be to follow the vocabulary of seed across the early Christian tradition. And I'm just going to give you a tiny, tiny flavor of that. We find that vocabulary already in the very earliest writings that reach us from a follower of Jesus, namely the letters of the Apostle Paul. For example, in these verses from his epistle to the Galatians, written, I'm going to just say circa 52 of the Common Era. Today, the first verse here is often read as a universalist manifesto. All distinctions of nation and ethnicity, of social condition and of gender are erased by baptism in Christ. But the second verse's vocabulary of seed, lineage, and inheritance suggests the association between kin, nation, and gods we've been discussing. Clearly, the reproductive aspect of God's promise to Israel still matters to Paul, even though we might disagree about how it matters. And in fact, early Christians disagreed on the significance of seed for salvation, but they all agreed that it was significant. So let me give you some examples of how they thought constantly about seed, as well as about other reproductive and agricultural techniques, such as grafting, about which I've written dozens of pages. In Galatians, for example, God remains a manager of reproduction, selecting for the gift of prophecy. See how here God set me apart from the time when I was in my mother's womb, Paul writes, in order to explain how he broke from the traditions of his ancestors. And here he's echoing God's words to Jeremiah. Do I have God's words to Jeremiah there? I don't know. No, I don't. But I'll read them to you. Before I created you in the womb, I selected you. Before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet concerning the nations. Jeremiah 1, verse 5. Paul is presenting himself as one more example of how the gods of the ancient world shaped relations with their peoples by intervening in the seed selection and fetal formation of their prophets. Of course, the most famous example of what I will provocatively call prophetic germline engineering, and I patent that line, is not that of Paul, but of Jesus himself. Questions concerning the biology of Jesus and his conception are absent from Paul's letters, but they permeate the later Gospels, and especially those we tend to think of as more Greek than Jewish. In the Gospel of Luke, Mary asks explicitly for explanation. How will this happen, since I do not have sexual intercourse with a man? And Gabriel draws on the concepts and vocabulary of Greek embryology to provide not only Mary, but all the questioning faithful of his day with an answer to that pressing question. And I won't go into the technical terms here, but the words that I've translated as spirit and power, pneuma and dunamis, are together with sperma, seed, basic and interrelated terms in Greek gynecological theories of sexual reproduction, whether Aristotelian, Galenic, or indeed many others. Here, for example, we find the same words being used by Plutarch to explain how Plato was conceived by his mother with the god Apollo, because Plato was thought to be the son of the god Apollo. Same words as in the Gospel of Luke. And Mary seems to find the explanation she's offered by Gabriel convincing. For in the hymn she offers in Luke 1:55, after the Annunciation, she praises God's fulfillment through her of his promise with respect to Abraham and his seed. Sperma is the word there, forever. Scholars today are becoming more interested in the role of ancient embryology in early Christian ideas about the reproduction of divinity and divine favor, producing titles such as, I can't really bring myself to read these with a straight face, so they're excellent resources for anyone interested in this topic. In early Christianity, these questions about the sexual reproduction of religious status were central and incessant. These questions applied not only to an apostle like Paul or to a Messiah like Jesus, but to every Christian. The first epistle to John, for example, explains that no one born of God makes a practice of sinning, for God's semen, sperma, abides in him, and he cannot keep on sinning because he has been born of God. And conversely, the logic could be negatively applied, as when Jesus in the Gospel of John condemns the Jews who believed in him at chapter 8, verse 31. So if they believed in him, why does he nevertheless condemn them? Again, the bone of contention is descent. The Jews insist that they are not illegitimate children, but are children of God. Jesus states the opposite. You belong to your father, the devil. We've already seen the quote, so I won't put it up again. Does this passage, John 8:44, mean that there are different races of people descended from different creations, with the Jews descended from the devil? If so, and the devil was the father, who then was the mother? Questions like these are very popular today. I showed you Dan Gayman as an example. We know that they were very important for the early Christians as well. This is from the earliest surviving commentary on the Gospel of John, from around 150 CE by Heraclion Philologus. And it puzzles over this passage. And it disagrees with exegetes who say that the Jews could be children of Satan, because it says that Satan can't have any generative power. He's a purely negative force without the ability to procreate. Now, Heraclion, the author of this commentary, favored an influential variety of Christianity that we today call Gnosticism. And this debate is yet another example of what I mean when I suggest that arguments about seed, and in this case specifically Jews and their seed, became important tools in early Christian debates between the groups we now call Orthodox and the groups we now call heretical. So I wish I could go into this debate, but let me just stress the obvious. The Gnostics developed many ways of understanding the creation and reproduction of the world in terms of the emanation and transmission of seed, first between different levels of divine and supernatural beings, and then between humans. I seem to have skipped the table. I have a beautiful table showing you all the Gnostic mixtures, and there's lots of them, and what they produce. But we'll skip that and just talk here about their basic idea, which was that through this transmission of seed, the creaturely variety of the world and the spiritual variety of mankind were created and reproduced. Insofar as they imagined the transmission of spiritual privilege and stigma through analogies with sexual reproduction of the flesh, the Gnostics deserve a place in the history of race and religion. But the same is true of their opponents, whom we today call the Orthodox, because they achieved their victories over the heretics, not by rejecting biomythologies and reproductive logics, but by producing seed doctrines of their own. So Tertullian, for example, often called the first theologian of the West, provides a nice example because he seeks to resolve the theological challenges by focusing again on seed. And here you see his response to the Gnostics who say the devil doesn't procreate. And he says, yes, she did. The devil's word was to her a seed, so that therefore, thenceforth, she should be abject and obedient and should bring forth in sorrows. And she did give birth to the devil. And in this case, you might say the devil is Cain, but you can see why the debate over who is the offspring of Eve and the serpent can take many forms. So early Christians did not think of the biologics they deployed in their emerging theologies as purely allegorical, as we might today. On the contrary, debates over what privileges and stigmas were transmitted by seed continued to generate theology, just as they do today. And I could go into the Pelagian controversy, and I could go into the Traducian, I could go into many, I don't know how these tables got mixed up. This is my table of seed mixtures from the Gnostics. And you can see there were a lot of them, and they produced many different outcomes. And I won't go into the Pelagian argument, but it's all about this question of seed, every seed in his own body. And I won't go into Augustine's response to the Pelagians, except to say that Augustine spent a lot of time trying to convince the Pelagians that this passage was not about human seed, but about wheat seed, etc. So all of this took place long ago, you might object, and in a galaxy far away. And that's true. So let me conclude with the religions born of our own place and time in the United States of America. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly known as the Mormon religion, was born in upstate New York near where I grew up, about 150 years before me. The word seed occurs some 182 times in the Book of Mormon, 100 times in just 2 of its tablets, Nephi 1 and 2, whose goal is to narrate the migrations of warring seeds from the world known to the authors of Genesis to that of 19th century America occupied by Joseph Smith and his followers. And I offer you here a map of those migrations as produced from the Book of Mormon as a teaching aid. Differentiating between seed lines was an important preoccupation of the early Latter-day Saints movement, with Israelite blood as a primary focus. By 1831, Joseph Smith and his family were identified with a seed of the Israelite tribe of Ephraim, an identification that soon extended by 1835 to all white members of the Latter-day Saints. In this respect, the Mormons shared a great deal with another white Anglo-Saxon Protestant movement, an Anglo-Israelite movement called the British Israelites. And you don't have to read all this stuff, but it just, again, the claim that it was the Anglo-Saxons who were the real Israelites, descendants of the blessed Ephraim, and that the modern Jews were accursed people who had falsely claimed the inheritance. The Mormons did not say that about the modern Jews. Early Mormon traditions assigned Jews to the tribe of Judah, of Israelite blood, but marked by their inability to accept Jesus as Messiah. So the teachings of the Latter-day Saints can be understood, among other things. I think I have, yeah. This is about the Anglo-Saxons, but no need to read it again. Can be understood, among other things, as filling in the migration history of divine blessing and curse from the ancient geographies of the Bible to North American topographies. That vast gap in space and time was bridged via the migration of the Mormon canonical figures Lehi, a descendant of Manasseh, who led a group of Israelite colonists into the Western Hemisphere shortly before the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem. And he had two sons, Nephi and the somewhat rebellious Laman. So I'm just summarizing for you how the seed transmission occurs. The Nephites kept the records that eventually became the Book of Mormon. By contrast, the Lamanites regularly waged war against God's people. They were a filthy, loathsome, and dark-skinned people, despite sharing Israelite ancestry with the Nephites. And I'm just quoting from the book of Nephi here. It's to this Lamanite lineage that Native Americans were assigned. Through such accounts, many peoples of the world could be accommodated within the Israelite inheritance. The 10 lost tribes have always been a very flexible instrument. There was one very marked exception. Joseph Smith himself ordained a Black priest, Elijah Abel. Note here the language of adoption and whiteness that Joseph Smith uses to make him a priest. But African Americans were quickly assigned to the seed of Cain in the early Latter-day Saints tradition. And they were barred from full membership in the priestly community until the priesthood revelation of 1978, which did not, however, explicitly repudiate the Cainite lineage. As the church moved its missionary focus to predominantly non-white areas of the globe, its seed theories faced new challenges. They had to explain new things. Mormon missionaries began to proselytize amongst the Tahitians in 1844 and the Hawaiians in 1851. These groups were assigned a special ancestor, a figure named Hagoth. I have a little cutout here for you. I don't know if I have a pointer here. I don't have a pointer, but so you can see where Hagoth figures in that line. He's a very minor figure who appears briefly in the Book of Mormon, only to sail away and disappear. And his own lineage is very ambiguous in the Book of Mormon. We don't know if he's Nephite or Lamanite, but he is Israelite. Aboriginal Australians, on the other hand, were grouped with Africans and ignored by early missionaries who focused almost exclusively on white Australian communities. And here the Mormons were influenced by and in lockstep with more scientific racism, which posited a close relationship between Australians and Africans. As secular racial theorists developed a new categorization of Aboriginal Australians in the 1950s, focusing on the similarities between, I'm getting technical here, the Torres Strait Islanders and other Pacific peoples, Mormons also began to reconsider their relationship with the Australians. In 1961, the church sent a small group of missionaries to Thursday Island in the Torres Strait and made its first convert. So in its ability to adjust its biotheologies and natural histories to the changing shape of the world it encounters, the Mormon church is no different from any of the other traditions we have talked about today. Conquest, migration, conversion, these have always stimulated the rewriting of ratio-religious histories. Nor are the Latter-day Saints more or less inclined to racial concepts than any other faith of their time and place. If there's one point I've tried to stress today, it's that these reproductive logics are available within the long history of many faith traditions. We should study Mormon understandings of the history of race and salvation, just as we should also study those of many other American communities of faith today, from ultra-Orthodox Jewish Chabad movements to the Black Hebrew Israelites, from the Nation of Islam to the Christian identity movement with which I began. We need to study these not because our faiths are necessarily racist, but in order to prevent them from becoming so and to critique them when they have done so. I hope I've convinced you that all of our faiths have the potential to produce racism through their seed vocabularies, as well as the potential to underwrite our most universal and inclusive ideals. It's precisely because these potentials coexist in our religious reservoir of ideals that we need to cultivate an awareness of their potential to produce prejudice. Second, in focusing on the long history that I focused on today, I don't mean to diminish the distinctiveness of the importance of racism in our own time and place. Our racism is different from previous racisms. Every racism is different from every other one, even though they also share a large stock of similarities. My goal is rather just to make us more conscious of the habits of thought that we all share so that we can be more conscious of those moments when we act in their grip. Why is it so difficult to dissolve these ideas about the reproduction of religious privilege? Finally, I want to insist that although I've oriented my talk today mostly around Christianity, I've tried to also give examples that show that all of these potentials exist in Judaism and Islam. And although I looked at the prehistory of our Middle Eastern religions, so I looked at Sumer, I could have made exactly the same kind of argument by looking at a different history. I looked at this one because over the last 500 years, Islam and Christianity have become the dominant global religions. But I could just as well have started not in Sumer, but in East Asia. The Mandarin word for seed planted semantic fields across East and Southeast Asian languages. And these seeds too accompanied stories about the involvement of their gods in human reproduction. Those stories also have been constantly transformed. A century from now, I'll make a prediction, I'll end with a prediction, so every prophet has a prediction. A century from now, as different powers and different cultures, different systems of thought extend their influence across the globe, it may be that histories of race and religion focused on Confucius or Buddha, or these words, as opposed to numen, sperma, semen, etc., will feel much more urgent than those concerned with Abraham, Christ, or Muhammad. But I'm focused on the religions that I know best, and that I think we should first remove the plank from our own eye. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Okay, I believe it's time for us to have our panel. I'm very pleased to have who is on our panel, and I'm going to introduce each one by name and then ask them to identify themselves and their connection with the community. And I'll start off with President Gerson Marino Rayano from Cornerstone.
Good afternoon, everyone. President of Cornerstone University. And I'm new, been in Grand Rapids for 8 months, and grateful to be here, and God thank you for the kind invitation.
And then Muaz Redzik.
Hello, I'm Muaz Redzik, the Imam at Bosnian Cultural Center. I've been in
Close, mic closer.
Is it on?
I think it's on.
Can you hear me? Okay. Muaz Redzik, the Imam at Bosnian Cultural Center. Been in Grand Rapids for, this is my 13th year. Originally from Bosnia, obviously, and 22nd year in the United States, half my life, and glad to be here today.
And Lisa Hogenboom.
My name is Lisa Hogebaum. I am.
Mic closer. That mic
Has to
needs
be
to be
really close.
right in your face.
All right. Is this better? Can you hear me? Okay. Lisa Hogebaum. I'm professor of intercultural and biblical studies at Kuiper College. I teach a course on Islam there and also intercultural studies. And so I am in the community a lot, bringing my students, and that's my connection then to Kaufman Interfaith Institute. I represent Kuiper College on that institute.
And Joe Kuhlman.
My name is Joseph Kylema. I'm a professor of social work at Calvin University. And I'm standing in for my colleague, friend Sven Lira, who is a medievalist and would be far more qualified to be on the panel, but is currently across the pond giving another talk over there about some of these same issues, actually.
Okay, and I think almost all of the panelists have had extensive experience in living in cultures with multiple religions. So I'm not going to call on you, but just who wants to talk about what that experience has been? Basically, what is the experience? And then later we'll get into the challenges and benefits from it. But just tell us a little about where you had that experience and maybe for how long. Go ahead, Lisa.
Awesome. I'll start. When I was in college, I had a couple of study abroad experiences. And then after college, that I ended up being a coordinator for one of those study abroad experiences and living in Istanbul, Turkey. And so that entailed students learning about Islam, a professor and courses that were that revolved around that. And it entailed Muslim dialogue. on the college level. And so that was many years ago, and I've continued to do that kind of work here in West Michigan with my students at Kuiper College.
Including, you teach a course in Islam,
Yep,
right?
I teach a course in Islam. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
So similar experience to Lisa, but I went to Calvin University and I've spent most of my 40 years alive in Grand Rapids within the sort of Dutch CRC community, and went to Calvin University where I now teach. But after I graduated, I went and lived in Nigeria for parts of 2004 and 2005 in the northern city of Jos, and spent quite a bit of time traveling around the north, Maiduguri and Kano and some of these places, and working alongside Muslim coworkers. We were doing microcredit, which was the great new thing. The Grameen Bank at the time was going to sort of revolutionize international development. So I was working with cooperatives of women who are often interfaith, Muslim and Christian women living and working together, borrowing money and insuring each other as collateral. And I was tasked with developing some training modules for this, which of course, as a new college grad, I was entirely qualified to do. And so for the very first time, I read through the Quran in its entirety. And for actually, I can admit, for the very first time, I read through the Bible in its entirety, and came up with sort of an interfaith training module about being an ethical business person. And that was sort of the beginning of my interfaith journey, both living in those interfaith communities and doing that sort of work to try to help bring along the development work that we were doing.
Okay. Go ahead.
My foundational experience was having been born in Colombia, South America. Hear me now?
His mind.
You can borrow mine.
Thank you. Great. My foundational experience really is having been born in Colombia, South America, to a father who's Jewish, raised in a Catholic family, and a mother who's Protestant. And as a young child, before we immigrated to the United States, really understanding the significant divide between Catholics and Protestants in Colombia as a child, and seeing some of the things that occurred that happened in my own family and in my upbringing. Significant formative experience, then also spending some time in Eastern Europe at Central European University as a visiting professor of medieval studies, and then sometime in Israel as well, in the territories as well as in Jerusalem, as a fellow for a foundation there, and then seeing the interplay between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam there in the Middle East as well. So significant number of experiences in these areas.
Good. And then share the mic back with Moaz.
Right, so being from Bosnia, the multi-religious and multi-ethnic country, quite unique. Being in an interfaith, inter-ethnic community and society and country as a whole is part of my upbringing, essential part of my upbringing. And I'd like to point out that the town I was raised in, lived my first 20 years of my life, my formative years, Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, is often called the second Jerusalem, where we have the main mosque, the main Catholic church, the main Orthodox church, and the main synagogue within the 1 mile radius, which is like 5-10 minute walk from my house, is really unique and something I'm proud of. It's been like that for centuries. However, my formative years, were in the part of history, I should say, of Bosnia, where it was, part of Yugoslavia and a communist country, where religion was not popular in the public sector. So I was taught to believe and practice my religion very privately. Of course, in the mosque, but more than anything, keep it to myself, which, interestingly enough, I actually came to value now. And for just one reason, the pop rock filter of everything that we see today, the commercialization of everything, including religion, is so overwhelming that this, not necessarily wanted, but, brought up reality of me, being, raised in a country where, again, religion was supposed and expected to be something very private and if not hidden in some instances, taught me to understand and practice my religion the way that I think the religion is designed, Islam, to be sincere from heart, no matter what people outside say, no matter what the trend is it accepting, inviting, inclusive, like the society that we live in, or a very opposite of that. It provides existence to my faith, no matter what the world around you is. That's kind of interior. However, being in a community where my teachers were, Orthodox or Catholic or Muslims, friends and neighborhood, I, again, probably because religion was not publicly expressed so much, many people in my town would say they didn't even know that, some of them were different religion or different ethnicity. Of course, that was not very often, but even when it was, for most of the time, it was at least, again, in the time when I was, raised, not a problem. It was something normal, absolutely normal to be in a society like that. So much for the
Okay, we're going to get to some of the challenges later, and I know because we've had, I've been to Sarajevo 4 times, both during Yugoslavia and after the war. So I know that there's been some challenges that you face, but let's move to that topic. I think everyone's had a chance to sort of identify what your experience has been. What were the challenges you faced?
Same order.
Well, I'll share.
Go ahead, please.
So in growing up before we immigrated, I think the challenge was living your faith in secret out of fear of public reprisals. And that was very difficult, obviously, as a child and young person, seeing that division in society, being afraid of persecution, violence. My grandmother became a Protestant in a secret underground group of people because she was afraid for her own life. So being raised in that situation is, you internalize and you have to learn to develop the virtues to have courage and so on. But then when we immigrated to the United States, we had a challenge of how do you live your faith publicly? We went to a public school, and there we encountered something very, very different, which was a public antagonism toward faith in a public school as a teenager, where living your faith out publicly also sometimes meant the bullying, the mocking, those kinds of things that occur in significant ways. And that was a completely different challenge that I had not encountered before. So 2 different things. One, opposition from within religion, and then also from outside of religion. Again, 2 very different kinds of oppositions that would call for 2 different kinds of virtues, I think.
Yeah, so I was talking about this with Paul Kortenhoven, but one of the things that interested me about my experiences in Nigeria, and since then I've led semester abroad programs in Ghana and Liberia, so predominantly West Africa, was the conflation, and Dr. Nirenberg talked about this to some degree, the conflation of religion with ethnicity, and then in the United States context with race, right? And how those debates get tangled or enmeshed with one another. And then the challenge then is how to engage in a pluralist society, right? To come alongside people who are different on any number of those variables or on all those variables. And I think that's one that my own institution, Calvin University, has faced as it's grown in Grand Rapids, if I can sort of extend the point. Many of you know, if you're from West Michigan, that it started as an ethnically Dutch denominational church, right? For Dutch men to become pastors. But now we have students from Ghana and Nigeria, and South Korea is actually our largest population of international students, how do we retain some sort of religious identity that becomes de-ethnicized or de-racialized? Because the experience for a lot of students, particularly those who come from Africa, come to the Calvin's campus, is that they come into a religious tradition that they don't quite understand. They have thought of themselves in terms of ethnicities or tribal identities, but they come to West Michigan and they become racialized, right? They become Black for the first time in a way that they hadn't necessarily conceptualized themselves before. For those of you, again, who are from Grand Rapids, this was in the news just this week, right? As this GRPD officer shot a young man who was a refugee from the Congo. And as his family was reflecting on that, they said, you know, we didn't quite understand what it would mean to come here and be racialized, to be Black, right? So I think that's the real challenge of this sort of work for me, is to try to disentangle religion from ethnicity, from race, and try to build on the universalist themes that do exist to extend towards the other, to love the neighbor, right?
I would say a challenge right now, if I can just talk about that, is the siloed world that we live in. Okay, so I am a professor at an institution where I'm trying to help students be messengers of peace, shalom, in the world. And many of them have never met a Muslim. Many of them have never met a Jewish person. And now, to make matters worse, we have COVID and pandemic, and we have social media that keeps us in our silos. Okay, so a challenge that we've always faced, but I think has gotten progressively worse, is that challenge of silos. And so then that engenders some fear. Fear was mentioned already as a challenge here. And so it takes some work to help students overcome that fear of the other. And so I think, the ways that I found to best meet those challenges is to get as much face-to-face interaction as I can. I mean, we're an academic institution and a formational institution, and as a professor, I have the luxury of saying, this is what we're going to do. We're all going to get in a room, Christians and Muslims, or Christians and Jews together, and then I help them overcome that fear. And of course, once they're in those spaces, it's wonderful, right? That's where the prejudices break down. That's where the fear is overcome. But I worry for those places, those times, where someone isn't doing that, right? Because we are so siloed, and the fear builds, fear of the other builds up until you get disastrous results, like what Dr. Nirenberg had on the screen with, or maybe it was just mentioned, but about the atrocities that we see in Texas, in Pennsylvania, and other places, right? The fear builds, and things are racialized, and pretty soon we have some really, really dire circumstances, including violence.
And I know, Mo, as your experience is when racial and religious differences actually are entangled in war, and you just don't get people together in a room and talk it through. Tell us your experiences.
Yeah, it's as a high schooler back in the 90s, that was really the first very strong challenge to understand and then process and then accept, meaning to live through not accept to like, but accept meaning to stay alive and stay sane through all of the destruction, suffering, and everything that I lived through. And because I was in Sarajevo during the entire 4-year siege, just today marked the 30th anniversary of the aggression on Sarajevo 30 years ago. And when I hear and listen, and we all do, news from Ukraine, and I sometimes must admit that I feel a little bit angry when I hear some of the comments about the war on Ukraine, in Ukraine, and on Ukraine, of course. Like this is the first time since World War II that such atrocities were committed. I'm like, did anybody live through amnesia 30 years ago? When Bosnia was not just not helped, but embargo on weapons was initiated. We couldn't even buy the weapons to defend from the third strongest army in Europe. But we survived. And so what I was trying to really understand is, as growing up in a society that was, boasting with the pride of being the what was it called? Non-alignment movement back in the 60s, not in the West, not in the East, but we carved our own way, kind of Yugoslavia being, perceived as one in the East, but really looking towards the West and whatever that meant. It looked like a lot of people in Yugoslavia, and Bosnia being the central republic of it, in the heart of it, did not live with each other, just lived next to each other. There's a huge difference between the two terms. A lot of people lived with each other, but a lot of people lived next to each other. It came to be totally opposite in the results. So, and of course, the racial connotations of, equalizing between the ethnicity and religion, brought up that mix, that chaos. Serb equal Orthodox, Croat equal Catholic, and Bosniak equal Muslim. It just played in the worst possible scenario that it could play, where Bosniak Muslims were perceived by those forces, obviously not all Serbs, but the political leadership and military leadership of Serbs at the time, and even now, sadly, perceived by the Serbs as the traitors of their own race. Like, you became Muslims, so you betrayed your race. You were Serbs who became Muslims. Look how the race plays into religion. Or some leftovers from the Turks who came and conquered area 500 years ago or whatnot. So that hatred was very hard for me to absorb, because I've always been taught and understood, people are different. We live in a society that is multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and we all thrive together, and that's what makes us strong. The brotherhood and unity was the highest parole in Yugoslavia. Brotherhood and unity, that was the communist parole between those nations and those ethnic groups. It all broke down. I was 8 or 9 when 14th Winter Olympic Games took place in Sarajevo, and I was so proud. I was a little boy, but I remember it very vividly. 8 years after that, Sarajevo became the biggest concentration camp in the world, totally besieged for 4 years. That was hard to process. But that again, that's the reality that we found ourselves in, and we lived through it. We survived. We continue to survive. And what's really troubling, to take on the last thing that I mentioned here, it looks like it creeps back in. Look at Ukraine. Look at all the things that are happening in the world. one of the political leaders' pictures was an hour ago here. He just won. And he said, one of the things he said, I think it was like, our victory was so strong that was heard on the moon. But he said, I think I'm going to paraphrase. I'm sure it will be heard in Brussels. So, I mean, it's very disturbing, the some of the, changes that we're going through. But again, it's a process, and we will do the best that we can do. And there is so much we can do, but we will never cease to do the things that we deem to be good, and we know that they're good.
Thank you. Let's turn now to what were the positive. What did you learn in that interracial, interreligious encounter that you had? What did you take away from it? We like to use the word holy envy. Sometimes you learn something from another tradition that you wish your own tradition had some of that with you. So anyway, along any of those lines, who wants to tell us some of the positive things and some of the things you learned in this interaction?
I can go.
Keep going.
Just so that it makes me rich to get to know people from a different background, religiously, ethnically, you name it. I feel stronger, I feel richer, I feel better. And that's what I am proud to be born and raised and live and still live now in a country that is different from the one that I was born and raised in. But again, having that experience and learning from other experiences, that's what it's all about. As a Muslim, the verse that Dr. Nirenberg mentioned here, or actually we mentioned in our conversation afterwards, I'm sorry, that, the Quranic verse that says we have created you from a single pair of male and female and made you into nations and tribes that you may know one another. The reason for that pluralism is to get to know one another. And the best among you is the one who is the most God aware of God. All right. So as the one source of all human beings, of all being, for that matter. So that's how I take it, and that's how I feel it.
Joe.
Yeah, so a couple of things I picked up from Islam, at least as I was encountering it in northern Nigeria. I had grown up in a tradition that has some sort of transformationalist social components, but can also tilt pretty pietistic and individual. And I think I picked up a pretty strong imprint of justice that I've carried forward from some of my Muslim neighbors. And then the other one that stuck out to me quite a bit at the time, especially as a kid who grew up in the 80s and 90s, the sort of turn towards a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, as the evangelical tradition would put it, and even sort of the rise of what sometimes people call the buddy Christ, who's your friend and sort of endorses everything you do and just wants to hang out with you and be cool with you. And my Muslim neighbors imparted a sense of the holiness of divinity, the holiness of God, that I found awe-inspiring. I really appreciated the way that they held God in reverence. So that those were two things that I took away, sort of a sense of awe. And I think the commitment to justice followed from that sense of awe, but and a commitment to justice.
I'll follow up. I can speak on behalf of myself. My very first interfaith interaction was with a woman from Iran I was paired with for tutoring English when I was in college. And she was the most delightful and hospitable person, open person that I had ever met. And then moving forward, living in Istanbul, we learned hospitality. That's where we learned what it means to be hospitable. And that's I'll just say that's what my students often say as their number one learning from the course that they take in Islam is the incredible hospitality that they receive everywhere they go. And whether that be, in the local masjid mosque or in homes or wherever it is. And so they're like, oh, yeah, we're Christians. We're supposed to be hospitable, but they are definitely the ones teaching us how to be hospitable, how to show hospitality to our neighbor.
It's one of the things that I've seen and learned through these experiences being either in South America or immigrating or traveling abroad has been the importance of human frailty and human suffering as a vehicle through which to show love and kindness to others. There's something powerful that unites all of us when we are on our deathbeds, when individuals are suffering. And I've seen that played out in a number of these kind of different situations as an opportunity to show forgiveness, to show love, to show kindness, to show hospitality to others. And that's a powerful redeeming force in those moments. So regardless, whether in my experience as an immigrant or being in South America, seeing individuals across the lines, these hard boundaries that exist, suffering when someone from the other side would show kindness and love or forgiveness, the incredible redemptive component that they would bring to someone's life. And I've seen that over and over, that this is something that's very powerful, something we should explore even further. I'm reminded of Simone Weil, the French Catholic philosopher, who speaks about the cry of the human heart is that good be done to us. And it's a cry of the human heart across dividing lines. So again, the opportunity to show love, hospitality, empathy, and to remind ourselves across the dividing lines of frailty and suffering that we all share, have shared, and will share at some point in time.
Okay, I'd like to move us to a broader discussion now, either interacting with each other or with our speaker. Do you have questions for each other? Or do you have questions for Dr. Nirenberg? If you get some questions, we'll ask you to come up and respond. Or I can hand you a mic either way. But let's continue the discussion. What do you want to say?
I do have a question with Dr. Nirenberg. So here's a question. The seed analogy, the seed theory that you spoke about so eloquently in your wonderful lecture, I'm just curious whether that analogy is something that exists only within religious systems, right, or religions. Is it possible to think of in our religious culture or society that could have the same analogy? Would you use a seed analogy that's not tied to religion, number one? And what would that look like? And perhaps a follow-up, if it's only tied to religion, is there an argument that someone could make that you must banish religion to banish theory, right? To banish that argument and hopefully, and then bring about peace.
Yeah, no, I think the reason that the seed story I told is dominant in so many world religions. And when Captain Cook arrived in Hawaii, he found similar arguments about taro root. And cosmology is built around taro root. So, these are they're all everywhere. The reason they're everywhere is not because of religion, or it's because of the interaction between our cultures and our aggregate cultures, meaning all societies that have learned how to use animals and plants to produce the necessities of human life have learned some of these logics. And you don't need religion to have them, but every society that's agricultural that produces religion, there's an interaction between some things we know really well and our cosmologies and our other ways of thinking about the world. Just every system of knowledge we have that has worked for us has affected other systems of knowledge. So mathematics works really well, and it's worked really well for humans for several thousand years. And then look how our religions begin to become mathematical, right? I mean, there's Christian Neoplatonism, et cetera, Pythagoreanism, all kinds of Christian scientism, et cetera. So it's not that it's only in religion, it's everywhere. I could give you a controversial example of how today you can have these seed analogies without any religion, but you could debate whether it's really a seed analogy, and you could debate whether there's no religion, but I'll give you the example of Donald Trump. on the stump in Minnesota just a few years ago, saying to Minnesotans, you have good genes here, right? And then bring out the racehorse theory of quality and the transmission of quality through reproduction, right? So he didn't invoke religion, he invoked horse breeding, but it's the analogy I've been trying to describe, that one feeds the other. Our success in one domain, the manipulation of nature, leads us to use that success to imagine other domains. And we imagine our gods working the same way as we work in the earth. So that, I don't know if that's an answer, but I want to get the Trump story out there anyway.
I'll jump on that because I'm a social worker, right? And that's eugenics, right? And eugenics is sort of the skeleton in social work's closet that folks like Jane Addams and Mary Richmond, if you're familiar with the matriarchs of the profession, believe they wanted to end poverty, but the way they were going to do that, or part of the way they were going to do that, is by breeding a better human race, right? So I hear echoes of eugenics in quite a bit of our political discourse around why people are poor, and this sort of ongoing debate about worthy and unworthy poor people. I was interested, Dr. Nirenberg, well, I love the analogy of the seed. I've done some thinking about race and Christianity, quite a bit about it, but I've been more familiar with the Hamitic hypothesis, Ham, and sort of the curse of Canaan, and the idea that, Africans are descendants of Canaan, and if you don't know the story, Noah is drunk in a tent, his son wanders in, something happens that biblical scholars debate about quite a bit, and then he pronounces this curse on Ham and his son Canaan, and you could understand that as a way of Jewish people legitimating their conquest of Canaan, but it gets twisted in early thinking to legitimate the slavery of Africans in the United States. So I was quite familiar with that. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see sort of that idea intersecting with this seed idea, because I think it does. I was just wondering if you'd talk about it.
Yeah, no, and it does, and even in the blessings of Noah's children, it's seed that's blessed, their seed, and the curse. It's interesting how much debate there has been over whether. The first, if we were at Yale, I would say that the first Black student at Yale in 1841, so you're not an undergraduate, but in ministry. I think it was 1841. In any event, his one treatise is devoted to this issue, to showing that first, only Canaan was cursed, and it doesn't travel generations, and that all of the blessings given to Noah and his children do travel down generations. Again, and using the seed vocabulary to try to demonstrate that. So you can see how an African-American living in a country with slavery, living in a country who uses this language to justify, sees as his most important task, once he's got the tools to do it, to take on that issue. So I do think these are really important. But I would also draw attention to the emergence of the Hamitic curse theory in early Islamic sources, in Tabari and the early Islamic historians, as a way of justifying the early Islamic enslavement of sub-Saharan Africans, the Zanj, in southern Iraqi marshes to create plantation agriculture there. And how with the Zanj revolts, the revolts of these slaves, which happened over the course of a century, very, very bloody. If you read at Tabari, it's like Game of Thrones. It's just, in order to justify their enslavement and their repression, the Hamitic story is brought up. And of course, you find plenty of great Muslim scholars saying, no, it's not what the Jews meant in the Bible, and it's not how reproduction works. Ibn Khaldun, the great Muslim scholar, says, the genealogists believe in the curse of Ham because they think that everything is done through genealogy, but that's not how. Yeah. But every society you can find has wrestled with these questions and these issues and used it to justify different kinds of oppression and to fight for different kinds of liberty.
Yeah.
Mr. Chance, any other questions?
I'll jump in one more time on this, because I could talk to you for a long time. But when I think about teaching the history of the United States and sort of how we think about race in the United States, I think about the question of race emerging at the question of whether baptized slaves, right, would need to be freed, which emerges in colonial Virginia. So I'm drawing here on my fellow Calvin grad, Willie Jennings, who's
Oh,
at
of
Yale.
course. Yeah, Willie Jennings. Yeah.
And has written a lot about this. But the first time I encountered legislation about the baptism, right? So Christians weren't supposed to enslave other Christians. So what happens when your slave becomes Christian because you have a missional impulse to convert them? Now you need an excuse to still enslave them, and their race begins to emerge in the legal code. And it's codified in really interesting ways related to reproduction, in that they explicitly say the status of the child is based on the mother, not the father, which is sort of counterintuitive in a patriarchal colonial society, but makes sense if you understand enslavement as having this systematic rape function embedded in it. That if you have a child born to, as they said, an Englishman and an African slave, that child can be enslaved even if they've been baptized, right? And this is all sort of legalized in earlier colonial Virginia. So these are the things I was thinking about. I was thinking about particularly the sort of the reproductive logics of this intersection of religion and race. I find that really compelling.
Yeah, I mean, we tend to forget, because we only know our own history a little bit, that slavery in the Muslim and Christian worlds that discovered, that came to the New World, to the New World, and that settled and conquered the New World, was built out of Islam and Christianity. And Muslims should not enslave other Muslims, but they could enslave non-Muslims, Christians and Slavs and pagans and all kinds of peoples. And they should enslave them if they had every right to in Islamic law. And similarly, Christians should not enslave other Christians, but they could enslave captured Muslims and captured non-Christians. Our word slave comes from Slav, because so many Slavs were enslaved as pagans. In fact, there's even stories about Christian kings in the area of Germany refusing to let the Slavs be converted because they didn't want to be able not to enslave them, right? So until Columbus, basically, you have the vast majority of slaves are Christians captured by Muslims, Muslims captured by Christians, and then pagans, sub-Saharan Africans. Religion is already everywhere over slavery. When you take this to the New World, it comes with it. So the famous Las Casas debate, when Las Casas is trying to argue why you should not be able to enslave the Native Americans. You can't enslave Native Americans by the just law. He wins that argument. But he says instead, you can theologically and legally enslave Black Africans, because he thinks of them as within the Muslim pagan category. And then later, as he sees that that was actually not true, he actually retracts on his deathbed and he says, I don't know if even my repentance will be sufficient for my salvation on this one error. But you see how interpreting these kinds of questions about religion and enslavability was so crucial to building that. And then I'll just one last quote. I don't know how many of you have read The Baptism of Early Virginia, but it's a book about American history from about 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And it's about precisely this theology of baptism and how it has to change in order to allow for enslaved people not to become free. And one of the ways it does it is by arguing that Hamitic peoples or peoples who are, they can't really convert. Their predisposition is against conversion. So you baptize them, they don't really become Christian. It's very much like this theory about Jews and Muslims, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, the raza theory.
In Spain,
Yeah, in Spain. But it's applied here to the Caribbean and to Virginia and to these Americans and African Americans. And a very powerful kind of justification for keeping people enslaved or for not recognizing the capacity of conversion to emancipate. Again, you think of slave and free, Greek or Jew, the Pauline dichotomies, they've been intertwined ever since.
Let's open let's open the audience for questions. Can you come down to the mic?
I missed the name of the person who said we couldn't enslave the Native Americans. I just missed their name.
Bartolomé de las Casas. He was, let me get this right. I think he was a Franciscan, but he may have been a Dominican. I sometimes get things wrong because I'm tired. Who came and he was bishop in the New World. And he got in a famous debate against Sepulveda and others, trying to defend the rights of the Native Americans who were dying en masse under the regimes of oppression and under disease. And so this famous Las Casas Sepulveda debate is often seen as the debate that set the path for Spanish laws protecting the Native Americans to a certain degree, certainly more than they had been protected before, and pushing enslavement towards Africa.
Any other questions from the audience or from our panel?
Yeah.
Doug,
Yes.
Oh.
could I ask, I'm curious, did the slaveholders who, Frank, you got a microphone? Okay.
Or yell louder.
Okay. There's a mic right here. Did the slaveholders in America believe that the slaves they were baptizing would be in heaven with them? And if so, would it be segregated?
I'm going to defer to Dr. Nirenberg here.
Yeah.
I'm a medievalist.
I don't have a clear answer on that. Unfortunately, it's a very good question. Certainly, I think there's some wiggle room within the biblical text to imagine hierarchies in heaven. And I think people seized on that pretty readily.
But I would just add that there are plenty of theologies that envision that with baptism and death, so with salvation, you became white. Even the quote from, well, this is early Christianity. So for example, Felicitas and Perpetua, these early martyrdoms, there is this idea that she will become a male when she enters heaven because she's been a martyr, and that blacks will become whites. But even with Joseph Smith's baptism of Reverend Abel, as admission of Abel into the priesthood, he says, you've been adopted into whiteness, right?
White man's burden.
Yeah.
So until that.
Anything else?
I'll add one local bit of color, right? So it's 2022. In 1821, so 201 years ago, this was all Native American land. This actually remained Native American land because we are on the north side of the Grand River, but everything south of the Grand River was taken in 1821. And part of that was very much based on religious and racialized logics of reproduction. Isaac Mccoy, the first missionary to Grand Rapids, who was sent here by Lewis Cass, became a huge proponent of the Indian Removal Act, testified before Congress on behalf of that, because he believed that Native Americans were a doomed race who, upon encountering modernity, were destined to not be able to compete with the healthy, virulent seed of white people. And so he thought the only way to save them was to move them all to Oklahoma and sort of put them on a reservation. So I think it's really interesting to think about how even that vision of whiteness has always been this mixed paradoxical vision of needing to be protected from being replaced while also being imagined as being the strong seed, right? So it's both the strong seed and it needs to be protected because it might disappear at any moment. It's just sort of an inherent paradox to how we think about whiteness.
Can I tell a joke?
Do it.
That is actually a true story. Two young men, Bosnian immigrants in St. Louis. This was actually documented by Akbar Ahmed in his book, The Journey into America. He did a field study of many cities in America and the Muslim communities. And one of the communities he visited was the Bosnian Muslim immigrant community in St. Louis. This was some 20-ish years ago. And he was talking to these two young men, and they were sharing their experiences with their friends, white Christian Americans, and they were kind of joking, and these white Christian Americans told these white Bosnian Muslim immigrants, says, race right, religion wrong. Can you believe that? It was mentioned in the book,
Yeah.
just, going off of that, so. I take it as a joke, even if it's a true story.
Okay, I think we'll wind up. For those of you that are planning to stay in the area, there is a map out there with restaurants that are within walking distance. I think the rain has calmed down a little bit, but we hope to see you back at 6:30 for the dessert reception and at 7 o'clock for the evening lecture on anti-Judaism. So thank you very much for being here and hope to see you later.